Okay, so hello and welcome, and thank you all for joining us this morning for the launch of Adoption from Care, which is the latest book in our Research in Social Work series. We're delighted that we're able to publish this book open access, and you can find a link to do so in the chat function. Put that in a second for you. If anyone like me prefers to read in print, then there is a paperback also available from our website, which currently has 50% off the duration of the conference. I'd now like to invite the panel to briefly introduce themselves, and then we will be hearing from the editors. Kenneth, would you like to start?
Sure. So my name is Kenneth Burns. I'm a senior lecturer in social work at University College Cork in Ireland. I co-wrote the chapter on Ireland in the book, and my research interests are child protection and welfare, staff welfare, and decision-making systems.
Great, and it looks like June's just joined us. Hello, June. Would you like to introduce yourself briefly?
Yes, I'm June Thoburn, and I'm one of the co-editors.
And Katra, would you just like to introduce yourself to everyone?
Yes, hello, I'm Katra Luhamaa, and I'm a legal researcher in Estonia, University of Tartu. I did work at the Bergen University for the last 2 years, so there I was more involved with the project. And I also 2 chapters in the book. One chapter related to Estonian adoptions from care, and the other chapter focused on international human rights regulation of adoptions from care. And this chapter I wrote together with Kenneth, with Conor O'Mahony from Cork University.
Super, thank you all. So we're now going to be hearing from Marit, June, Katra and Taya, who will be talking a little bit about the background to the book and some of the issues raised, and then we'll be opening up the floor to questions, so you can unmute yourselves for that or feel free to put anything in the chat box.
My name is Marit Stevens. I am a professor of political science, and I'm writing on adoptions from
Isabel, the audio is too low. When you share the video, you have to press a button that says share computer audio.
Oh, hold on. Thanks, Kenneth.
You probably have to unshare and share again.
Okay, thank you very much. Kenneth, can you just tell me where I should be looking for that? Is it, I've got optimized for video clip or share sound? Okay.
Share sound. It's share computer sound, share sound, something like that.
Okay. Thank you. Let's try that again. Please let me know if this doesn't work.
Hello, everyone.
That works.
My name is Marit Stevens. I am a professor in political science, and I'm here today to introduce the book Adoptions from Care. This is a book that I have edited together with Professor Jo Thoburn from East Anglia University, a professor in social work, and Tarja Puuso, also a professor in social work from Tampere University in Finland. Many, many thousand children are placed out of home by the child protection system. They are placed out of home because their parents are unable or unwilling to give them sufficient care. The child protection system will typically place children in a foster home, but also it is used institutional care, residential units of group homes. Some children will be reunited with their birth parents, which is the whole purpose of the child protection system. to help families to manage their life together. But for some children, this is not possible. It's not possible to reunify them with their natural parents. And adoptions from care is about this group of children. There are children that are growing up in public care. And the question is, how can governments, how can the state properly care for these children? Is the state a good parent? Is it possible for the government to care for this group of children? And many professionals and many lay people would say that the answer to these questions are no. So, why a book on adoptions from care? Foremost, because this is extremely important for the children that are growing up in public care. It is a general agreement and well documented that for some children, adoption will be the best way of securing permanence and a long-lasting family for the children. There are three components in what we call the permanence. Adoption will secure legal permanence. Adoption will also secure residential permanence. And thirdly, adoption will secure the relational permanence. So you will be bound to a new family by law, by the physical place where you will grow up, and also by your emotional connection. And what research pinpoints is that adopted children have higher levels of emotional security, sense of belonging, and general well-being. Surprisingly, given the importance of this topic and the seriousness of the interventions that the state can do in these cases, we have very little knowledge on what is going on. How do the state make these assessments? How do the state make these intrusive interventions? Is it legitimate that they terminate parental rights? And are the government, as I asked earlier on, able to care for these children? Are the outcome good for these children? We have huge knowledge gaps in terms of how, when, and why children are adopted. And just a simple example. A study published in 2019 shows that a range of European countries are not fulfilling simple, basic accountability principles when it comes to adoption from care. The article concludes that we actually cannot say and we cannot know what is going on in these proceedings. We don't know if they are legitimate or if they are illegitimate. And tellingly, this article is titled The Hidden Proceedings. The title of our book is Adoption from Care, International Perspectives on Children's Rights, Family Preservation, and State Interventions. The book includes chapters on adoption from care in 9 different countries. It includes policy developments and statistics from Austria, from England, Estonia, Finland and Ireland, Germany, Norway, Spain, and the United States. There's a wide range of countries and countries that we are not that familiar with. So it will be extremely interesting to learn how they are thinking around adoptions from care, but also on their approach to child protection in general. In addition, we have chapters on attachments, on the family, contact arrangements, and the European Court of Human Rights. So yes, this book attempts to fill some of the knowledge gaps. And clearly we are unable to fill them all, but we do have some indications on the policy trends, and we do have documentations on distinct differences for the trajectory and for the life stories for the children in care between countries.
Hello. As social policy and social work educators and researchers from very different countries, we three editors were aware that in high-income countries that share many family and child rights and child welfare principles, based as they are on the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, there were big differences in the extent to which differential uses were made of adoption from care as part of the child protection services. We linked up with colleagues from 7 other jurisdictions with a range of family welfare and child protection policies to explore the extent of these differences and why they might occur. The first steps were to be clear about the data on children entering care and indeed entering long-term care because of child protection concerns, and to understand trends in adoption. In the introductory chapter, we first chart the reduction over the past 30 or so years of adoption as a form of family formation, whether by voluntary, in-country placement, in-family adoption, or internationally. The largest proportion of those placed for adoption now is those placed from public out-of-home care as part of their child protection services. In the introductory chapter, we start to hypothesize about explanations for these differences, which we would ask the chapter authors to explore. These might include different histories and approaches to the role of the state in providing family welfare services, different attitudes to family rights and responsibilities, and willingness to legally sever the links between parents and children via adoption, different interpretations of the principles shared in all the jurisdictions of the paramountcy of the child's needs for stability and family membership, and how this is weighed with the continuation of birth family links, and differences in legal systems. Is adoption legislation aligned with child welfare legislation, or is it totally separate? It has been an important learning journey and a pleasure to have worked with the scholars and practitioners who have contributed to this book. I am sure that readers from across child rights and child placement services will find much to take away from its pages. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Katre Luhamaa, and together with Conor O'Mahony from University of Cork, Ireland, I wrote a chapter that shows how international human rights norms deal with adoptions from care. While each state is generally free to decide how it organizes adoptions in their state, international human rights law limits the state's discretion and defines principles that all adoption systems should follow. Our chapter discusses both the limitations that are binding to all the 9 countries included in our adoption book, but it also discusses the European requirements that bind 8 of the countries included in the book. The instruments that we analyzed were the Convention on the Rights of the Child, European Convention on Human Rights, European Convention on the Adoption of Children, and shortly also the Hague Convention on Intercountry Adoptions. We analyzed all the key provisions in these instruments and to find key themes and principles that these documents oblige the states to. First, the principle of the best interest of the child. It is a principle that has to be at the center of every adoption decision, and it has to be a paramount consideration in these decisions. This is a very strong legal obligation, and the best interest of each individual child has to be evaluated in every adoption decision. While there might be also other relevant considerations, for example, the wishes of the biological parents or the importance of the adoptive parents, then the best interest of the child should be the principle that guides the adoption process and is the primary driver of it. Secondly, all of these instruments stress the importance of hearing the child and listening to the views of the child. Furthermore, these conventions also require that the states specify from which age the consent of the child is required for adoption. This obligation to hear the child is both a procedural obligation, meaning that each and every adoption proceedings should have hearing of the child as one element of the proceedings, but it's also a substantive requirement to hear the child and take into account the child's views, also having regard to the maturity of the child. Finally, all of these instruments, to a more or less extent, discuss the institutional as well as procedural requirements for adoptions. Adoptions have to be governed or authorized only by institutions that are state controlled and that are competent to do so. This means that the adoption proceedings within the state should be dealt by a single institution or similar institutions following the same rules. Secondly, the state should take control over the process of the adoption and set out the obligatory steps for such decisions. For example, hearing of both the adoptive parents as well as the biological parents, assessing the capabilities of the adoptive parents, as well as taking into account the views of the child, should all be part of the process and evaluated fairly and without any bias. To conclude, international human rights do limit and frame states' discretion in adoption decisions, and international scrutiny that is included in these instruments helps to make the process more transparent. Thank you.
As you have learned before in the earlier presentations, the motivation for this book has been to explore adoption from care and to learn how children's rights are practiced and weighed against parents' and adopters' rights in present-day societies, and how governments and legal and welfare professionals balance those rights and discharge their duties of care to those children who cannot grow up in their parents' care. As editors, we have learned a lot, but here in this short presentation, I would like to mention three main findings. Firstly, the book has demonstrated that children in care for protective reasons are more likely to be adopted in the United States and in England, and that these two countries have well-developed guidelines and practice frames. In other 7 countries included in this book, including countries with risk, family services and children's rights orientation to child protection, children are rarely, if at all, adopted from care. Interest in adoption within child welfare policy is not in general strong. There are also countries which do not even recognize the notion of adoption from care. Secondly, there's surprisingly little country-specific research providing information about the different stakeholders in adoption from care, the characteristics, the views, coping mechanisms of children, birth parents, and adopters adoptees are only rarely studied outside the countries, making more frequent use of adoption from care. Those child protection systems have to make policy and practice decisions based on the limited information they do have. And the third main finding follows from the second one and builds on the notion that adoption from care does not take place in any social or historical vacuum or isolation. As the rationales of child protection systems, welfare states, and the history and cultural meanings of adoption vary, the messages from research elsewhere have to be adapted to specific country contexts and their understanding of private and public responsibilities, rights to family life, and children's rights. Children needing long-term care from the state should be given the best possible option to grow up, and the provision of options should be based on research-based knowledge of their strengths and weaknesses. We do hope that this book makes that argument clear and provides some new insights into this complex issue. Thank you.
Thank you all. I hope you found that interesting. I know I found it very insightful myself. We'd like to open up to questions to the panel now, so please feel free to unmute yourselves. It's quite a small group, so I'm hoping we could have quite a good chat here, or else feel free to put anything in the chat box.
Can I ask the first question?
Sure.
So again, my name is Kenneth Burns. June, did anything surprise you in this book? You know, when you started and what you thought you knew about these countries to what you came to learn about them. So did anything surprise you?
I think there was the thing that struck me in a way is how little we know in different countries about what does happen to these children who are not adopted. We were trying to look at get data on the comparison between those who remained in long-term foster care and those who were adopted. And although all the countries are committed to a sense of permanence for children, the actual long-term outcome research on those who aren't adopted isn't very good. So the two countries who use adoption, USA and UK, have been much better at tracking their children. So there is a research deficit on long-term foster care. Seems a funny thing to say when we're talking about adoption, but we have to know what the alternatives are. I think I'd just say one more thing. I was struck by the clarity of the division between whether you are a country like Norway, where adoptions from care is originally by the original foster carers. There's that route, so the child might well have been in placement for quite a while with the foster family and then is adopted. And countries, UK being England an example, almost all the adoptions from care are by, if you like, stranger families. And that was a starker distinction than I think I'd anticipated.
Very good. So can I hog the floor for one more minute?
Of course,
I just ask you in terms of where you think, what trajectory are we on, do you think, in terms of the countries? So I'll speak personally in relation to Ireland. So Ireland has just created the infrastructure, both an amendment to our constitution, which is superior to our law. We've amended our legislation, and we are now in the process of updating our frontline policies to make the pathways easier for children in long-term care, or at least children who are in care for greater than 18 months to 3 years to become adopted. So whether all of that infrastructure is going to lead to an increase in the numbers of children in long care long-term care who are going to be adopted is another matter. So my question, June, is do you see a trajectory? Do you see, because the 7 of the 9 countries have a very limited tradition of children in long-term care being adopted, but do you see it, is there any trends do you see, or do you think it's going to stay as it is?
I think the interesting thing is this tension between family rights and children's rights, and each country is quite rightly grappling with that, because I'm a social worker. Social workers have a duty of care to the people, the parents of these children. I think there's a bigger interest in, shall we call it open adoption? I think countries are beginning to realize the enormity of a total severance model of adoption, which exists, I think, in some of the countries. I see countries nodding, you know, so some countries still have this absolute total severance. Once you're adopted, that's it. And I think perhaps if there will be more similarity between long-term fostering and adoption, because the children who are adopted tend to be the youngest. Whereas when older, if countries have more older children coming into care, then they're not going to greatly increase the amount of adoption. It's the very youngest who are likely to be adopted. So difficult to know, Ken, but I think Ireland is moving more in that direction, perhaps as an Anglophone country. It's interesting that the Anglophones do seem to have taken on this more. I'll shut up. Maybe Kathy has to say something.
Yes, I was just thinking of the Estonian chapter that you wrote, and I think what was perhaps most surprising for me in there was the way that adoptive parents are obliged to fulfill much smaller requirements. For example, they don't have to go through obligatory trainings, unlike foster parents, for example. And like in England, also in Estonia, the adoptive parents quite often are strangers to the child. So they don't want to foster a child. They want this kind of permanence from the first moment that they meet the child. And therefore, it was very surprising to see that the state is very lenient towards the adoptive parents. If someone is willing to adopt, this is sufficient enough for at least Estonian state. And of course, as June mentioned, then the lack of follow-up and the lack of control afterwards, because once the new family is formed, then again you have the obligation not to interfere into the family life of this new family. So you have this kind of interesting tensions, and the state is actually understanding that these tensions are there, and they are trying to through informal means perhaps support the parents, but on the other hand, their hands are also short, because family life is this kind of very important value, and privacy and non-interference into family life as this kind of human right, or basic right in Estonian constitution, as well as the European Convention on Human Rights, is valued very highly. So there are these kind of interesting tensions also in terms of what is required of the adoptive families. Are they supported, to what extent, and when?
Isabel, there's a comment in the chat, maybe. You're on mute, Isabel.
So I was hitting my space bar, not having much luck with the tech today. Right, Paul Daniels posted to say, I think the influence and the increasing reliance on kinship care will have an impact too. I wondered if you wanted to comment, if the panel wanted to comment on that at all. I know I'd be interested to know the reasons why you think children in care are adopted by relatives in some countries, but not in others.
Can I take this one first?
Yes, you
this
take
is something
that.
we're particularly interested in Ireland. We just published a paper in the British Journal of Social Work, if people are interested, which is to do with what in some countries is called kinship diversion. So children are being diverted away from the care system into informal, what some will call informal kinship care. And then there is the formal kinship care, which some countries will call relative foster care. And there's a developing trend in Ireland, or the numbers of children in care in Ireland is staying relatively stable or dropping a bit, but the number of admissions to care has fallen off a cliff. It's dropped about 62% in the last 9 to 10 years. And there is some anecdotal evidence. Our study was specifically about the use of voluntary care. But when we were talking about voluntary care, practitioners increasingly were misunderstanding us because they were using informal kinship care instead of voluntary care increasingly in some teams. So of course this does impact on the numbers of children who are then available for adoption because they're not even in the care system. So therefore the state may not keep some of those cases open in terms of ongoing support and ongoing full payments. And of course, there are broader issues in terms of the poverty impact of some of these decisions. So I'd like Paul to come in and say a bit more about it, but in my view, there's a connection. There's something going on in some countries in terms of thinking about the informal kinship care system, the formal kinship care system, the formal foster care system of non-family members, and adoption as a broader continuum. And as to whether there is a joined up kind of policy and a joined up kind of strategy amongst social work departments and child protection services about making the right decision for each child about which pathway is the way to go, and then how you move between those pathways. And as June said, in our case, in Ireland, it's very clear we don't know enough about that. We don't know enough about even, and the strength of this book is about documenting the policies, procedures, the legislation, the norms, both national and international norms in terms of what ought to happen. And we're very much at a point of not having enough information about even what happens, not to mind, as June was talking about, in terms of what system is, what are the outcomes like in each of those pathways. So yeah, that's a really interesting point.
If I may also then, from the Estonian perspective, although there is this kind of also lack of data, so the statistics collected by the state is not sufficient to have this kind of general conclusions, but it seems that long-term fostering is more favored by kinship families, meaning that kinship families in Estonia do not adopt the child, but they are satisfied with long-term fostering or guardianship, as we call it in Estonian. So most of the adoptive families are new families. So this is an interesting dichotomy, I would say, that in a way that kinship families do not want to end this fragile relationship that the child might have with the biological parents, whereas the adoption is then something that happens into a very new family where there are no this kind of further connections. And I think June very importantly mentioned also this open adoptions concept that some of these countries included in the book are practicing, for example, Norway. So I think that Estonia is far still from this idea that you might have open adoptions where there is connection between the biological parents and the child that continues even after adoption.
If I come in there on the kinship, it is interesting if you look at the trends in the two countries. Big users of adoption from care. The USA does have adoption by kin, and indeed a great deal of the foster care in the USA is by kin, whereas the English legislation very specifically discourages it. You really have to make an extra special case as a kin adopter on the grounds that it's confusing for children to not know whether it's your mummy or your grandma and who's your auntie and that sort of thing, but also that we therefore have special guardianship legislation which is appropriate for kinship care, long-term kinship carers. But I think it makes, I mean, you see therefore that the curve in England, the amount of adoption care is going down, and it's going down because of the move towards special guardianship for more children, And I think there is a discomfort, shall we say, with the total severance model. As social workers, as I've said, we do have a duty of care. The people whose children we are taking into long-term care are themselves vulnerable. Many of them have themselves been in care or indeed had been adopted. So this discomfort, I think, is turning itself into more careful thinking about routes to permanence, and particularly the age range is of the children coming into care is crucial, because although UK and US place a lot of children from care, they are the youngest. If you enter care aged 3 or 4 onwards, you are highly unlikely, even in these countries, to be adopted, which is why we have to keep looking at all the alternatives: kinship care, long-term foster care, reunification, and I think this book is really exciting because it tries to grapple with how does a country make a choice. The thing that struck me as well was I'm thinking of Estonia, I'm thinking of Spain, I'm thinking of Germany. They still have baby boxes. They still have the possibility for a parent to deposit their child anonymously, and therefore some of the adoptions in those countries, Spain is quite a high rate of adoption of infants, and that comes from the possibility of placing for adoption. And I think, Katri, in countries like yours with a high incidence of residential care for young children, I think you have more adoptions of those very young children who are sort of abandoned.
Yes and no. It is still both finding foster parents as well as or individuals willing to foster, as well as the adoptive parents, is very difficult in Estonia. So quite often we call it family-based care, but it is actually quite often institutions where you form small family groups where these children are placed. And yeah, what we see decline in care orders because we place the children with the kinship families, and grandmothers particularly are picking up the slack, are doing the work of the mothers quite often, and in that sense, this kind of on the one hand, it seems that Estonian government is currently trying to conceptualize better. So is adoption also this kind of alternative foster placement, and how should we use that? Because also in Estonian legislation, you don't have it very well situated, or in policy documents, you don't have it well conceptualized. So I think that there is much more room for Estonian adoptions to develop, and especially for the very young children who are actually, as you correctly state, placed in institutions and who live long-term in the institutions. So certainly finding a suitable foster placement or then an alternative adoption would be a better outcome for them. Yeah, so it is. I think this comparative aspect is extremely interesting in the book. We had only one country, i.e. Estonia, in this selection that also has inter-country adoptions, and I think that this is a theme that also would deserve then later discussion, perhaps. But because in inter-country adoptions, you have all these issues even further accentuated. For example, the ability to control the adoptive parents, the ability to see what happens later on. So I think that that there are very many avenues still that we haven't touched in this book, but from my perspective, it is a very, very interesting beginning of conceptualizing the importance of adoptions from care.
Thank you, that was fascinating. Inga, you look like you've got a question. Do you want to unmute yourself and put it to the panel?
Thank you. I come from Denmark, where we just now have a very deep discussion about adoptions. I'm a researcher in placements. So I'm also taking part in this discussion. We have had the opportunity in Denmark to put carriers in for adoption for the past 10 years, but the possibility hasn't been used very much. I think around 50 children has been adopted, and nowadays we have around 12,000 children and young people placed outside their homes, so it's not very much. And the political discussion taking place just now is about adoption without consent. The government want to improve the possibilities of placing of children placed outside their homes to be adopted without consent. And they're not talking about open adoption, they are talking about so-called normal adoptions. Do you have anything? I'm looking very much forward to read the book, but do you have anything, any discussions about adoptions without consent?
Almost all of it is about adoptions without consent, because most of the children being adopted from care are adopted following the making of a care order. But I think as a heavy user, as it were, the UK, I think we have to be very careful to look at context, actually, because we users of adoptions from care shouldn't be saying to you in Denmark, why don't you do it? we should be saying, look at our research, look at what's happening and comparing it with your context, because I'm not sure if I'm totally up to date, but I think more of your children enter care when slightly older, largely because you are rather better at providing, this is the family rights bit, you are rather better at providing support to families. So that if your entrance to care tend to be older at entry, then probably you might look at, if you like, the Norway route of adoption by foster carers. Whereas our route has been recruit strangers, but then you have this move from the foster family where they have to go in the emergency. You get maybe the child's fairly well settled and then has to move. So that's not very good for children either. So then we're trying early placements, but every country is different. And the notion that one country's got the answer is something I think as researchers and practitioners, we have to fight. What I'm interested in, why the Danish or indeed the Norwegian population, foster carers in particular, haven't grasped at adoption. Maybe for the foster carers, they like to stay in touch with the birth families, but maybe if you're a foster carer, part of your motivation is not to totally sever a child from its family of origin.
Yes, and there's a lot of research showing that the biological parents are very important for children in out-of-home care, even if they had been placed most of their childhood, and even if the parents had not been very useful as parents, they are very important for the young people. That's one of the issues.
That is appropriately there as social workers. I think the other thing is the learning from the outcome research, because although adoption does a very good record in terms of stability, we are now learning through longitude. In terms of research, we need data. We need really good administrative data, which follows through children in careers, but also we need the longitudinal follow-up research. And what we now know is you need to be a very special person to adopt from care. It's not like just having your own family. Teenagers struggle. particularly. We are now learning that adopters, that it appears to be going well, and even young placed children may well have all sorts of serious issues, like assaulting their adopters. So finding very special families to adopt from care is what you need. And again, I think this business of placing for foster care first, as in the Norwegian route, might be a better route, because by the time they decide to adopt, they know each other, basically.
If I may, very shortly then, all the chapters cover also the legislative as well as policy instruments that govern adoptions from care. And we also deal with the work that is done with biological parents, as well as the possible contact arrangements after the adoption. So all the chapters, according to the guidelines given to the authors, do cover these issues. So I think that there is rich comparative material available there.
Inga, it's a really interesting question about the broader issue of dispensing of parental consent or overriding parental consent and how that's done. But even if the infrastructure is there to do that, in Ireland's case, you must go to the High Court to dispense with a parent's consent, and it happens. So we would have maybe between 15 to 25 adoptions from care every year, and we have a population of about 6,000 children in care at year end. So the numbers continue to be very small, but one has to come back to professional disciplinary issues about and discomfort with, even if the infrastructure is there, that doesn't mean it's the right thing to do for that child. To try and dispense with a parental consent. And I say that as somebody who has done it. I have gone to the High Court and I have dispensed with parental consent in a very specific case where the parents were people who lived on the street, were street drinkers, foster parents, and the young person themselves wanted to regularize their situation. They wanted to have long-term decision making. They wanted to have permanence, and it was their choice to proceed. And it's interesting for the profession and related professions and civil society organizations and representative bodies to have a conversation about that, because it is the ultimate state, it's, I suppose, the state's use of power to dispense with parental consent. It's a sensitive thing to do. It's one thing for the state to apply for a care order, which can be rescinded. It's a very different thing for the state to extinguish those kind of connections. But in our chapter, we talked about, well, what does that really mean, particularly in Ireland, where adoptions from care are children who are more than likely age 16 and 17. So we have very few adoptions at a very young age. And in reality, it's going to be an open arrangement anyway at that point, because the children have some relationships with their parents. So while Ireland operates a closed adoption model, in practice, it's an open adoption model because those connections continue. So yeah, I mean, it's you probably get a lot from the book in terms of how each country thinks about and what it has done to address extinguishing parental consent, and how nervous countries are rightly about doing that. But yet that doesn't mean that there aren't cases where it's appropriate. There obviously are cases where it is appropriate to do that, even if people have some discomfort about doing it. And this is where it comes back to Catra's point in the video and earlier, in terms of, well, how do we think about what's in the child's best interests, and what does that really mean? And how do you square that with with parents' rights and parents' wishes?
I think there's a very interesting difference between the USA and the UK for those countries looking towards those of us who do this. In the USA, if the child cannot go home, then he or she must be adopted. That's the only criterion. If reunification is not possible, then adoption is what you must do, and therefore you also have kinship adoption. much more. Whereas in the UK, and I think in Ireland, only adoption will do. In other words, you have to look at all the alternatives, and adoption is a last resort. So the social services have to show that nothing else will meet the needs of the child other than the total legal severance. There's quite a big difference in those two approaches if you're considering termination of parental rights. You can only in England cut them off if there's no alternative. In the States, it's just a simple choice between go home or be adopted. It'd be interesting to know what you're doing in Denmark in terms of severance of parental rights.
Should I say a bit more to that? At the moment, we have very few children in care had been adopted, and they were very young, under 5, all of them. But the system in Denmark is that the municipalities decide whether to make a placement or adoption, and we also have the sentence about the best interest of the child. And I think it is very difficult to make this decision. This is a very unclear concept, and one municipality can make one assessment and another assessment. Among these, I think 58 adoptions we had in Denmark for the past 5 years. One of the municipalities out of 98 in Denmark had 14 adoptions, showing that there can be very different assessments in different municipalities.
The court decision seems a very important, this total severance. It isn't a pure best interest decision, everything else, but apart from this total legal severance, which is not a pure best interest decision, because all things being equal, you don't go for adoption. You have to show it's better.
If I may also jump in, then this was the giving the right to the municipalities to deal with adoptions was also something that was practiced in Estonia, but that received strong criticism from the Convention on the Rights of the Child Committee, which stated that you have to have uniform regulation, you have to have uniform practices. And therefore, Estonia only recently then had all the adoption proceedings done by one state agency, and now this is they collect all the and they control all the adoptive parents' data, and they ensure that everyone is treated more widely, that whether the municipalities should have such wide discretions, how do you ensure that this discretion is used similarly, so that people could expect the same kind of outcome to their problems. So yeah, I think that this is very interesting.
Thank you. We've got another question from Paul Daniel, who says, do you think we're moving away from the idea of substitute care and psychological parenting paradigms? If so, isn't there a worry in terms of risk and harm narratives?
I think I might be able to speak now. Can you hear me?
Oh yes, you can. Go ahead.
Let's see how. So before my question, I'm just where I am. So I've been looking at this in terms of kinship care and what that means in terms of, because it's neither kind of fits neatly into kind of substitute parenting nor kind of family preservation type things. But also I'm really interested in this whole what Kenneth was talking about, this whole idea of informal kinship care and the, you know, how that fits into kind of deregulation, regulation kind of debates that are happening, certainly happening now here in England. But yeah, so I'm just finding this all really, really fascinating, just in terms of where it kind of fits, because and I still haven't come up with this answer, because I can see the shift away from kind of the Goldstein, all of that kind of stuff, kind of substitute care type kind of narratives to the more kind of open adoption type narratives. And my worry is that, having spoken to the kids, they still want to feel safe, and they still have those concerns about their parents. So if we kind of open it up too much, actually, you know, if we go too far the other way, then the worry is that the children will feel at risk and possibly even be at risk. So I'm just interested in the balance, really.
I think I totally agree. I think I did the chapter on contact as well, and very much drew on Beth Neal's work, but also Elaine Farmer's work on kinship care. And I think it's very wrong in England that a special guardianship order is not seen as serious as an adoption order. I think it should be, frankly. It is too easy for special guardianship orders to be removed. I'm totally committed to the sense of permanence, but I'm also interested in some people call the adoptive kinship network. That this notion of total severance doesn't work well. You know, you got this family, drop, you got that family. And we know from the children that doesn't work for them, other than for a very tiny proportion. Therefore, some way of working and recruiting adopters and recruiting foster carers who understand, and kinship carers, how to get that balance right. And it differs in each case, doesn't it? Sometimes with kinship carers, there's a lot of contact with the birth family. With others, there's very little.
So and it's really interesting what the kids have been saying to me in the research, is that actually, if we stop thinking of family in terms of just one or the other, but in terms of actually it's kind of a big thing, it's growing, involving, I have more contact, maybe not even think about it as contact, but I have more kind of connections in some ways with some bits of Beth Neal's type of stuff, everyday practices type of things, through storytelling, family resemblances, whatever it might be. So it's just kind of thinking a little bit bigger in terms of what family actually means, and this is what these kids are actively doing.
But the question is, do adopters want that? You know, are people?
Well,
you know, that's a dilemma for looking at Denmark or Norway. If you want to increase the number of adoptions from care, you have to tell a story about ordinary family life. People, you know, most of the adopters from care tend to have been families who couldn't have their children by birth. Are they looking to be part of an adoptive kinship network? Answer, no.
Yeah.
And that is the dilemma for, I think, countries like Norway and Denmark who want to move in this direction, not to go overboard, as I think we did in the UK, by saying, oh, you're childless, you want a family, why not adopt from care? And for some of those families, it's been very, very difficult.
Just to extend that question, June, what do long-term foster carers want in countries where the state may be pushing towards more children being adopted from care to address permanence? Because it's unclear that those who, in Ireland's case, were assessed as foster parents and became long-term foster parents, whether they want to go in this direction, whether they feel coerced in this direction. So in Ireland, as of the last year, at every childcare review, which is every 6 months of the first 2 years and every year after that, the question has to be asked in terms of permanence planning. And the question then has to be asked in terms of whether adoption should be considered. And what message that's giving to children, and what message that's giving to birth parents, and what message that's giving to long-term foster parents in terms of why they got into this and what they hope to get out of it. It's one thing to be a long-term foster carer, but it's a very different thing to become an adoptive foster parent in terms of lifelong commitments, and maybe that's not what you were interested in. I was at your presentation, Paul, yesterday, and I'd love to hear more about it, particularly in terms of children, because we may do some research in Ireland in the future to talk to children and young people. And again, I'm going off topic, but in terms of informal kinship care, this broader question, because you were asking about risks and harms, and there's a very celebrated judicial review in Ireland called the PG case, where the state diverted a child from care to a grandparent. The grandparent became the carer. The state closed the case, didn't provide ongoing care, didn't provide a payment. It's not special guardianship as understood in the UK. And yet the risks continue, and the grandparent had no formal decision-making power, didn't receive formal payments in terms of supporting the care. There was a risk of the children going back, and the state refused to get involved and said it's a private family matter that we should not be involved in. So I think it's very valid to ask kind of questions in terms of, well, what was in those children's best interest at that point? Because there is sometimes in some countries is the sense of, let's get the state out as quickly as possible. I think maybe particularly in terms of risk-orientated type of states, where it's not necessarily a bad thing for a state to be involved when it provides some stability, a source of support, a sort of social in-home services, and particularly support around decision-making, particularly when there's conflict within families about the care of the child in terms of who can be the decision maker. So I think this broader question about adoption and the adoption from children from care sweeps up a broad range of themes. It might seem like a narrow book in one sense of just adoptions from children from care, but it's not. It really brings in these other kind of broader themes, narratives, questions, debates that we need to have in relation to states and families looking after the needs of children, young people, babies, when alternative care is required, whatever that alternative care or substitute care, or whatever the appropriate thing is. And I think that's what people will get from the book. They'll get kind of ideas in terms of how it all fits together. And this book is kind of just one part of how it all fits together, I think.
I can't wait to read it. Honestly, it's fascinating. I mean, I might need a break from it all for after I've done my Viva, but after a few weeks, I can't wait to read it. I just find it all very fascinating, and I personally, I've only just been, in the last kind of few years, been looking at all of this kind of stuff, and I just find that I flip around quite a lot in terms of what I do know. What I'm very certain about is that there has to be, children need to be safe. There has to be regulation, but it has to fit the child's needs, and that's the difficult bit, isn't it?
Yeah.
So how do we manage that so that
I think in the end it has to be courts as well. I was interested in what Inga said about it being left with the municipalities, because it is such a huge thing to do to terminate parental rights, and it's complicated. It's every case is incredibly. There's no easy answer. I think that as authors, all of us, we really welcome carrying on with this debate. Paul, Daniel, Inga, get in touch with any of us, because there's so much we haven't said. Basically, we as editors, we pushed and probed, and some countries in particular, we tried to get to the bottom of the data, which was very confusing, and in the end, there are lessons to be learned from every country, basically.
Inga, you look like you had something to add there. Did you want to chip in? You're on mute still, sorry.
Thought I did. Yes, I think the decision making about how to support child and family to make a placement. In Denmark, we also have a lot of placement at residential care centers and different kind of very professional residential care centers, or foster families, or choosing adoption. I think you need to be very careful when you look at parents and say they can never be parents. I've been doing research within this area for 30 years, and I've heard a lot of placement histories from children and young people. And for some of them who had been first in a foster care, then in a residential care center, and then the family suddenly came back. The mother found a new husband, and the child came home. And if you look at the papers of these case descriptions of these young people, you find that the municipalities had said that the family was not able to be parent. Several times. I made a study some years ago at some very special residential care centers for families in Denmark, where the municipality can place the mother even before the child is born, and then have an intensive support, both giving treatment, but also making observations of whether it's possible to develop the competencies as a parent. And it's a rather expensive intervention, and the municipalities only choose this intervention when they're almost sure that the child should be placed outside the home. And the study I made found that only 1/3 of these children were placed outside their home. The other 2/3 had some kind of interventions afterwards, but not placement. They saw the possibilities of developing the competences of the mothers. But nowadays, all of these children might have been adopted.
Yeah, so there is a similar case from Norway, Strandloven versus Norway, that was decided by the European Court of Human Rights and the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights, and where precisely this kind of parents' child's right to long-term stability versus then hope that parents could perhaps in the future be better parents and have better resources available to them was balanced, and so this is perhaps an interesting case to read, and this is also covered very shortly in our international law chapter. But yes, there are different ways that states do support parents, and it varies, of course. There are these countries where this kind of support is more control or checking out the family. There are others, for example, I think Spain is very good in supporting young mothers with young single mothers and supporting their learning and their entering into the workforce, etc. So there are very different mechanisms available, and this is certainly an issue to discuss, but also then ultimately what is in the best interest of the child. Is it in the best interest of a child to live in institutional setting and waiting for the parent to improve? Or is it this kind of long-term placement, secure placement with adoptive parents in the best interest of the child? It varies, and different countries take different approaches here, but I think that this is also this kind of question of, is the focus on the child rights or is the focus on the parental rights? And in a way, ultimately, an obligation to choose, which is more important for a particular state.
Thank you. I wondered if I could ask, sort of, obviously you've touched on children's rights quite a lot already, but if you had to sort of boil it down, I suppose, what would your key messages be in terms of children's rights?
So we discussed it shortly in our chapter, but we have also written an article about case law of the European Court of Human Rights in regulating or in deciding adoptions from care judgments. And from there, it is very obvious that the court is interested in whether the child's best interest is evaluated in the process, but it also looks at child's relationships. So it asks with whom the child has attachment, with whom and which attachments then are relevant for the secure development of the child. And we see in the adoption judgments of the European Court of Human Rights that these new developed attachments are deemed quite often more relevant than this kind of unstable attachment to the biological parents. On the other hand, of course, European Court of Human Rights stresses very strongly the rights of the parents and the importance of support given to the parents, importance of social services actively trying to help the parent and the child to reunite or to retain contact. So quite often the lack of the contact or attachment is the lack of social work with the family. So I think that from the child's perspective, it is very difficult to generalize because what is in the particular interest or what is in the best interest of the particular child in the particular setting within the particular problems that the family has is very varies a lot. So what is important is that the attachment is analyzed, that there is social work with the family prior to removal, prior to adoption, and if possible, then contact or the child's right to identity, meaning right to know who the biological parents are, right to know your background is also important.
I think in a research conference, one can't, particularly with infants, you are predicting, what is that you're talking about long-term welfare. So qualitative research as well as quantitative, but certainly quality, you need good administrative data so that you can track children through, including those who are adopted, because they get lost to system at the moment. But you also need the qualitative research that you're both, I think, describing, so that children's voices can go on being heard well into their 20s and 30s. And some of some of our studies inevitably go back 20 odd years, 30 odd years even, because in order to pick up on the people who were adopted, we've now got children adopted without consent from care well into their 20s and 30s. So we're not any longer having to rely on baby adoptions. The evidence is there, and I just think that Paul Daniel, you're talking about Twitter. There's some really important people on Twitter, adopters, adoptees, who are talking about the complexity of what they might have said when they were 5 might not be what they're saying when they're 15 or 25. It's complicated. I'm also worried about costs. It worries me that some governments think it's a good idea to get their children adopted. I won't mention any particular government. Think it's a very good idea to, if you place your children for adoption, you get them out of care. If, as in Denmark, Norway, they remain in care, they cost you a lot more.
I've noticed there's also a shift, I'm not sure in adoption, but certainly in kinship care, but this whole idea of peer support as well, which is great, but on its own I worry that it's almost kind of a little bit of a substitute for actual state support and state financial and practical support as well. So yeah, don't worry about that too.
Yeah, this is certainly an issue in long-term fostering by the kinship carers, who quite often do not receive the same kind of, at least in Estonia, do not receive the same kind of support as other foster parents would. So they would receive ordinary child support that is universal, but they are not receiving this kind of additional foster carers support. And so the state in a way has split the two approaches. So if you're in kinship care, then you are the problem of your wider family, and when you are in state care, then the parents are not, in a way, almost allowed to enter this debate.
But there's and I think that whenever I'm kind of peddling my wares at the moment and I'm talking about my research, one of the questions that always comes up is about peer support or specific groups, and I always say, of course, it's very much welcomed, but I just worry that there is this drive, as you say, just to say, well, actually, yeah, they do need support, but the state isn't going to help with that, because you just use the community around you, build up your community, and then you'll be all right, type thing. It's just not.
Thank you so much. It's been brilliant.
The message is, when children have been harmed, and that's what we're talking about, they're special children who need special care, and it costs. And whether you send them home, whether they're placed with kin, whether they're adopted, whether they're long-term foster care, you need to put the services in. Governments don't like that message, though, and they're not listening. So. Do you think we're running out of our? I think this is. Sorry, Ingrid.
We've got some final point from Gunnar, and then I do need to wrap up anyway.
Isobel, we can't hear you. Your sound is very strange.
I apologise for that. I don't know if this is any better. I think we probably need to. No good.
Can I ask?
Oh, you have to mute.
Could you make sure that the chats get sent to Paul Daniel and Inga Marie? It's hard to. Is that possible, Daniel?
You can save it. You can save it, can't you? You can save the chat. But I've been furiously opening up things as I've gone along as well. So it's there somewhere. But yeah, that'd be really helpful.
I don't think that the finances is very important in the Danish debate. I think that the concerns is about that almost half of all placements in Denmark break down. And we have a lot of children, around 40%, who have a childhood where they go from one placement to another, maybe one foster care, another foster care, and then at a residential care center. And this lack of continuity, I think, is the main issue when you then talk about adoption. But you can ask if the lack of continuity is the issue, is the only answer adoption. You could find ways of improving the skills of social workers, the organization of placements and other things.
I think Jill Schofield's research on long-term fostering ought to be in the equation, because we couldn't find out. We were trying to get data from the chapter on the alternatives and long-term foster home stability, and we couldn't actually get it from most of the countries, and it's so important to know. And if there is that rate of foster care breakdown, what's going wrong? Because adoption isn't the answer for anybody coming into care other than aged about 2 or 3. Isabel, you're going to.
I don't know if you'll be able to hear now.
I think that, shall I say that on behalf of the authors, great to see you all here again. I think we've made a very good team. It is a fascinating book. It's been fascinating to edit it, and Policy Press have been wonderful as editors. So I want to say a big thank you to them, and a special thank you to the Bergen team. I'm sorry, Daniel and all, you know, the way you've shepherded us through it. It's been wonderful. So I want to say thanks particularly Paul and Inge for joining us. Shall we sign off now? And thank you. Thanks, Isabel, everybody. Bye. Lovely to meet you all.